very much, Dasa. It's a very, very warm, very generous introduction. And as usual, I think I start every talk that I do here at the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I always say how pleased I am to be at the Sheffield Buddhist Centre, and I am very delighted to be here. I come here a couple of times a year, and it's always a pleasure to come here. I always find it very stimulating, inspiring. I have a lot of friends here, and the other thing that's very striking on Sangha Night is to see a lot of old friends, but there's a lot of people here I've never met before, which is a really wonderful sign, because it just shows me how alive and active the centre is. So I'm very pleased to see quite a lot of new faces here as well as old friends. So I'm going to talk about spiritual death and rebirth, and there needs to be a story in there too. I feel as I'm standing here talking about this, I might undergo a spiritual death and rebirth as I'm speaking, because I'm finding it increasingly difficult to actually prepare talks. Back in, not so long ago, I'd script talks very, very fully, and I'd have a stack of notes over there. But some years ago, I just couldn't do it. And on the train today, coming up that journey up from Norwich to Sheffield, I was, what are you going to say tonight? What are you going to do? This story, that story. And even thinking about it was a sort of challenge. So I don't quite know what's going on there. That's why I say perhaps there's a bit of a spiritual death and rebirth kind of going on in terms of giving a talk. Some people say the most frightening, terrifying thing you can do is give a public talk. It's never really been a problem for me for some reason. I've never found it particularly terrifying. But I'm going to start with a story. And the story is a sort of personal reminiscence. I was ordained in 1976, a long, hot summer of the summer of punk, the summer of the West Indies thrashing England in the Test series. And I was ordained that summer on a weekend retreat. I've been involved in the Tree Ratland, the FWBO, Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, as we called it then, for a couple of years. All happened a little bit more quickly in those days. It was a small community, so there was quite a lot of contact with Sangha. I learnt the mindfulness of breathing, Metta the sevenfold puja, did Dharma study, of course, study text. But it has to be said, it wasn't so sort of systematic as things are now, where there's an enormous amount of material available, and you go on special retreats at different sort of stages in your spiritual journey, which is, some people get nostalgic for the old days. I don't. I'm not at all nostalgic. Right now is the best time. And we were very, very confused in those days. And if you have a lot of young, I'm very young, immature people around, you can get quite a lot of unpleasantness, a lot of competition and things like that. The only thing really holding us together was Sangha, and this incredible vision and inspiration. Of course, he was a much younger man than Sangha, the founder of our order, and doing a lot of teaching, a lot of communicating. So I was ordained by him on a weekend retreat, and at that time, as well as I was introduced to a new meditation practice, because when we were ordained, we're given a mantra of a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva, and we use that mantra, it's a string of sound syllables, to meditate on a particular Buddha or Bodhisattva form, an archetype of enlightenment, might symbolise particularly compassion, wisdom, or energy. So I was given a particular practice. I was very grateful to that. It was something I really wanted to do, having quite a devotional sort of temperament. So I took up that practice alongside mindfulness of breathing, Metta, and there are other practices that Sangha had taught. There was a practice called the contemplation of the 6 elements, This is especially for order members and people preparing for ordination, where you contemplate the fact that your psychophysical organism is made up of earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And by earth, for example, is meant solidity, water, fluidity, fire, radiation, air is pretty obvious, the breath, and you occupy space, and you have a consciousness that's aware of it. And you reflect that you are not the originator of any of that. You are not the owner of any of that. It will all be, you're constantly borrowing from the outside world and constantly giving back. And of course, at death, it all returns. And you do this to completely loosen a narrow identification with a fixed sense of self, to open up to a vast, open consciousness. Very important practice. So that practice was around, and various other meditations, various other contemplations. So these were all around, and the main emphasis for most of us was mindfulness of breathing, metta-bhavana, this is in the order, and our visualization of the Buddha or Bodhisattva. And working it all out with a kind of mixture of inspiration, incredible enthusiasm. We were also working hard for the Dharma. In those days we were converting the old fire station into the London Buddhist Centre, where I eventually ended up, not long after being ordained. So a lot of energy, and really enthusiasm, but in a sense, not a lot of clarity, except from Sangha. And then there was this order convention. So this is a gathering of the whole order. This was in 1978. And so this was men and women coming together, those who were ordained, in a school in Sussex in the summer holidays. And this is a very important moment, I think, in the life of the order. Sangha was incredibly active. He gave 3 full-length lectures. He chaired symposia by different young order members, myself included, on different themes. He led the meditations and pujas, guided us in different meditations, and there's this very strong sense of his presence. And one of the lectures he gave was a lecture called A System of Meditation. A System of Meditation. It's a very important lecture which you can find an edited version of in the Guide to the Buddhist Path. I think that's what it's called these days. And this was a very important lecture for all of us, because what he did, he showed how our different meditations fitted together into a system, into a progressive series, as well as bringing out different aspects. But he sort of concentrated more on the whole idea of progression. This was very, very helpful. Very, very helpful. So he said, first of all, you have the mindfulness of breathing. He said, there you are. And how did he say? I remember he said something like, as we come stumbling along to the meditation class, to the Buddhist Centre, some of us, loosely held together by a name and address. So what have we got to do? We've got to gather ourselves together. We have to integrate. And the main practice here is the mindfulness of breathing. We need to develop some continuity of purpose in our life and bring ourselves together through particularly the practice of mindfulness. But then, alongside that, you need to develop very, very strong, as he called it, positive emotion, particularly through the metta-bhavana practice and related practices. And it's very interesting when he talked about positive emotion. He said some very strong things. He said that without very strong positive emotions, there is no spiritual life. There is no Dharma life. He's not saying that you can't work on through developing skillful intention, but he means more precisely that if you're really going to make any real progress in the Dharma, in human development, you need strong love, strong compassion, strong sympathetic joy, strong equanimity. You need to, he said, they need to be hot emotions. Very, very passionate the way he was speaking. And of course, it relates to an earlier teaching that we were all very aware of, that for most of us, the major issue, the central problem in Dharma life, in Buddhist life, is to find emotional equivalence to intellectual understanding. Intellectually, we know it all. I mean, probably all of you here will know why it's a good idea to love and not to hate, and you probably know quite a bit about how to follow the path. But emotionally, we lag behind so often. We know intellectually, but our emotions are not engaged. So we need that very strong emotional engagement. So Metta and related practices are tremendously important for that reason. So then he said, you have to remember, I was, 21 at the time, 21. So this is all very formative. That's why it's so vivid to me. I can even picture him in his old monk's robes and very long hair, and you know, a strange sort of mixture of sort of kind of like a Buddhist monk, but like a sort of tantric sort of siddha figure, and an eccentric Englishman. A real strange mix. So very, very vivid. Then he said, through these integration and positive emotion, you build up a very, very positive individuality. So this is tremendously important, very positive human individuality, integrated, mindful, together, and also very bright, positive, friendly. You're really, you think, well, that's enough. That sounds great. And then he says, but that has to die. Wonderful though it is, it has to die because it's conditioned. It's dependent upon conditions. And this is a tremendously important point in Dharma life generally. A besetting sin, I think, of a lot of people taking up the Buddhist life. They don't pay enough attention to the Buddha's teaching of conditioned co-production, the basic insight of the Buddha. Our Dharma life is dependent upon conditions. The conditions that we put in, our regularity of practice, hence the importance of daily practice as well as going on retreat and carrying on the practice into daily life, but also putting yourself into positive external conditions that really support that life. You know very well, you meditate better, when you're on retreat or when you're at the class, when you're at the centre. It flows better, and you can feel yourself going backwards sometimes when you're in other conditions. And sometimes people say, yeah, but you need to toughen up, and you shouldn't be a hothouse plant. But hey, come on, we need protection. We need to protect our, what we gain in the Dharma. So it's a condition, sure, a conditioned practice. That's a good thing. You need to put the internal conditions in place and put yourself in the positive external conditions, especially with Dharma friends. But because it's conditioned, it can be gained and lost. It can be gained and lost, and I'm sure you have that experience. You have a wonderful meditation one day, or maybe a sequence of meditations, everything's going fantastic, and you think, that's it, I've arrived. I'm there. Only for some weird reason, maybe you've had a bad communication with somebody, or I don't know, who knows, bad dream, or something happens, and suddenly you're thrown back. And that wonderful experience, where's it gone? Where is that wonderfully positive individuality? Where is that serenity? It's gone. Maybe you even doubt whether you had it. Maybe you think it's a kind of fantasy. Kind of made it up, cheated yourself or something like that. Then it comes again and goes again. And this way we can get a bit blown around. It has to die in order for an unconditioned, I'm going deliberately paradoxical here, an unconditioned self, that's not the right word, unconditioned being to arise. So this is why we need this stage of spiritual death. he then went into why he was using this language of spiritual death. I know some people are very uncomfortable with it. They're not sure of it. They don't like it. Even people within our order are very uncomfortable with it because they sometimes forget, well, hang on, afterwards there's spiritual rebirth, so everything's going to be all right. Don't worry. You're not disappearing into a black hole. Well, maybe not. So why did he use this language? Well, what he started, the way into that was talking about the Buddhist notion of śūnyatā. And he particularly talked about here the 6 element practice that I mentioned, contemplation of the 6 elements, which is a practice to realise voidness or emptiness. This is what śūnyatā literally means. It's realising that you and everything around you is completely empty of any abiding, permanent, substantial self-nature. It doesn't mean that there's nothing there. That would be an extreme. That there's nothing finally that you can point to and say, that is a self, that is a person, that is a thing, that is truly existing. Everything is constantly in flux, constantly changing, a flow of conditions. It's voidness, it's śūnyatā. And then he said, well, śūnyatā can be the different. The trouble is in Buddhism, even particularly with the teachings on śūnyatā, although it means emptiness, and emptiness of even being able to fully name what is, there's an awful lot of intellectual cogitation about it. It's quite extraordinary. If you read the Perfection of Wisdom literature, which runs to thousands and thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of words, it's all about not being able to say anything about anything. Really, it's quite extraordinary that you think, crikey, how can they keep talking so much about not being able to say anything about anything, because everything is empty of self-nature. So this just shows you the highly intellectual nature of a lot of medieval Indian Buddhism. So he talked about different ways in which śūnyatā is translated, some of them very expressive. Herbert Gunther, who was very keen, a great scholar of Austrian descent, who ended up living in Canada, who's very influenced by existentialist thought, he translates it as the open dimension of being with a capital B, which is very expressive, this sense of something completely open-ended. That conveys something about the experience of śūnyatā, or spiritual depth. There's no end point. Everything is open. Sangha little commentary on that was it's indefinite openness in the direction of reality. Indefinite openness. You're not putting any check on your own unfoldment in relation to the truth. No holding back in relation to the truth, because you've seen through what holds back. But he said, all these translations are unsatisfactory. The best translation of śūnyatā is death. And you could feel the sort of shock in the room as he said that. None of us had heard this before. Death. That's the best translation, because śūnyatā represents the death of everything conditioned. All your conditioning, positive, negative, whatever it might be, dies when it comes to the fires of emptiness, when it comes to the great tiger's cave of emptiness. This is an image from Zen Buddhism. The tiger's cave, an image for reality. Tracks lead up, no tracks lead out. Your tracks lead up, but they don't come out of that cave mouth. You're just entering into this state of spiritual death. And he said that, and he was talking about, I think, a period of his own life, that sometimes as you go on in your practice, you can feel tremendous primal fear. Whether or not you've been meditating on śūnyatā or anything like that, you might have just been doing the metabhavana or the mindfulness of breathing, but you can sometimes hit, particularly in meditation or in life generally, a completely nameless primal fear. So much so that the hairs in the back of your neck are standing up. And he talked about this as being the breath of śūnyatā. You're feeling the breath of reality, the breath of emptiness, breathing on you. You know, what's going on when you experience that deep fear, that deep nameless fear? It means that you're changing. It means that you're really taking it seriously. Part of, maybe you haven't realised how seriously you're taking it, but something very, very deep down is being affected very, very strongly by your practice. And that can be very frightening because the unknown is opening up. And when something is unknown, you feel that as complete destruction. You feel that you're going to be completely sort of obliterated. So that is where the primal fear comes from. So that's why he speaks at this stage as the stage of spiritual death. And sometimes you can have this experience, you know, that you really have sort of like those cartoon characters that keep running off the edge of the cliff. And they suddenly look down and there's nothing there. And there's that sort of panic. Sometimes you can feel that in your Buddhist life. You suddenly realise you're way out beyond way out beyond the known, what you know. That can be very frightening. You can even start to doubt fair enough, doubt the wisdom of keeping going. You can wonder, is this a good idea? And it's very interesting, the Buddha himself underwent this kind of experience before his enlightenment. He deliberately tested himself. He reflected on what he called the panic, fear and dread, the bhaya. There's a whole sutta devoted to this, the panic, fear and dread sutta, where he reflects, well, if you have any trace of craving, hatred, delusion, any trace of self-clinging, when you put yourself in very, very fearful environments, the fear will come up and it might destroy you if there's any trace of that to the extent you have that self-clinging. So he tested himself by, he said, going on the no-moon nights right into the depth of the jungle. And of course, in those days in India, the Mahavana, the great forest, the great jungle, covered most of the middle country where the Buddha operated, what's known as Pradesh, Bihar. He went right into these places and just sat there, or walked around, or lay down, whatever it was he was doing, meditating, reflecting. And, suddenly in the silence there might be a sound of a stick breaking. Or maybe it was just the sheer silence itself, or maybe the sound of an animal cry, or something like that. And he said the panic, the fear, the dread would start to pour over him. But he said, what I did was, I didn't let that take me over. And I wouldn't distract myself from what I was doing until it had dissipated. Very important teaching. He didn't fidget, he didn't change his position. If it happened when he was lying down, he stayed lying down. If it happened when he was sitting, he stayed sitting. If it happened when he was walking, he just carried on walking until that fear subsided. So that's the breath of śūnyatā. That's coming into an encounter with spiritual death, this complete, radical change, the change of our total being. That's what we have to kind of open up to. Look, when you practice the Dharma, you keep going, you have to open up to this. Sangha actually once said there was a period of his life in Kalimpong where this fear would just come over him. He might be sitting in his study, writing, he might be talking to somebody, he might be giving a Dharma talk, he might be meditating, and this fear would just come. This deep, primal fear. So we said, what did you do? And he said, well, there was nothing I could do. There was nothing I could do about it. I just had to carry on and metaphorically bow my head until it had washed over. And what happens, I think, this deep fear, it indicates that we're still not fully ready to open up fully to spiritual death. So we've got to do all that. We've got to keep doing the mindfulness of breathing, the metta bhavana, we've got to do the devotional practices, we have to meet with spiritual friends, we have to keep studying the Dharma, so that we keep increasing, as it were, the base, keep widening the base of our consciousness so that the movement into radical letting go, radical renunciation is much more even and serene. And it becomes, in the end, something not to be feared, but you realise this is liberation. This is complete openness. This is, the vastness of space. The vastness of space. And this leads us on to the spiritual rebirth aspect, because when you meditate on a Buddha or Bodhisattva in the Buddhist tradition, you don't just chant a mantra and just imagine a Buddha figure. There's a whole procedure. And the first part of a practice like this is to create this vast sense of open space, which you can do because you've been doing meditations to do with spiritual depth. So you actually imagine a vast expanse of clear blue space in all directions, above, below, across. And it's not just a pretty picture, it's not just a story you're telling yourself, it's something that you're really genuinely experiencing because of your prior practices, this vast open space, and you have the corresponding sense of freedom and openness. And you'd think, well, that's enough, but no, it's not enough. You've actually got to look deeper and see that this space does not obstruct the arising of forms, the arising of significant forms in this case. And this is the Buddha or Bodhisattva on which you meditate. And Sangha has a particular way of looking at this meditation. He's saying the Buddha or Bodhisattva that you meditate on is you. You as you will be when you have spiritually died. You at the end of the path. It's a really very, very inspiring vision. Is, that we have the potential to be this figure. And of course, the figure that you choose, that you take, needs to be a figure that you have a deep, deep feeling for, a deep emotional connection. It's your myth, if you like. And I don't mean myth in the sense of fantasy, but the deep sense of meaning that you're attempting to unfold in your life. So you might just take the Buddha himself as the embodiment of wisdom and compassion and freedom, all the qualities of enlightenment. But it might be another form. It might be green Tara, for example. Beautiful feminine, female form, symbolising the very quintessence of compassion. It might be Manjugosha, a lovely honey-coloured form with a sword, a youth, embodying transcendental wisdom. It could be Padmasambhava, the great tantric sort of shaman, siddha, magician, guru figure. But it needs to be something that really moves you, really touches you, really makes you want to get out of bed in the morning and visualise. So this is how he explained on that retreat these different practices and how they came together. And it was enormously helpful. It's the first time he'd really heard him do this, talk about the Dharma in this way, talk about the path in a way that was very vivid, because when you look at traditional books on the path, it can seem a bit complicated. Here we just had some very simple things to do. Integrate, get ourselves together, put ourselves together, develop positive emotion, develop love, be friendly, be kind, pull yourself together in that way, turn yourself into a healthy, or reasonably healthy human being. Pretty straightforward. Iron out all the kinks, all the weirdnesses, if you can. And then die. Very simple. Let go of that completely. And open up into this other dimension, this other place. Very, very straightforward. Now, that's a sort of story, and I've mentioned there, about me, listening to Sangha. But I don't think that's really enough. I think the Daniel won't be disappointed unless I put in a much more sort of juicy story. So I think I better end this talk with a story which illustrates spiritual death and rebirth. I'm not sure that I can really point any morals and practical issues from this story, but Vdanya's going to do that at the end of my talk. He's going to mention the things that perhaps you could follow up in the groups. Thankfully, he's very good at that. And the story does indeed concern a figure who I find incredibly inspirational. A kind of figure that has something to do with history, but is much more a myth. And I don't mean that myth as a fantasy, much more, how can I say, myth is true. In a way, it's a deeper truth very often than history in fact, because it's pointing to spiritual meaning. And the figure is Padmasambhava. So Padmasambhava was an 8th century Indian figure. We know there was an Indian figure called Padmasambhava somewhere up in the northwest, what is now in Pakistan area, somewhere up in probably north of Sindh province, somewhere up there now, kind of Udayana is the old name for it. So that northwest area, which we know was a very, very important creative area for Buddhist practitioners, particularly to do with tantric Buddhism. And but Padmasambhava himself, all sorts of stories sort of accrue to him. He becomes this archetype of enlightenment, particularly symbolising transformation, continuous spiritual death and rebirth, if you like, because it isn't just one big death, one big rebirth. It's actually something that goes on all the time. There's constant death and rebirth. So in some ways you could say spiritual death and rebirth means really entering the path of continuous, radical transformation of self and world that really has no end. So Padmasambhava particularly embodies this. So Padmasambhava was raised, he was a kind of a foundling. The stories are, Padmasambhava means the lotus born, because the story is that he was found, a fully grown 8-year-old, in the middle of a lotus by a childless king who raised him. But you know, foundlings, and especially if they've been taken out of a lotus, are going to be notoriously difficult to raise in the ways of the world, and they're going to have a bit of trouble with their parents. And sure enough, Padmasambhava became completely unmanageable, because he wanted to leave. He wanted to get out, but it being an Indian situation, he was not supposed to be the next king. So he misbehaved very, very badly, doing wild, ecstatic dances on the top of the palace roof, and wearing garlands of skulls and things like that, doing all sorts of weird things. So eventually he was sent, because he did so many bad things, he was sent into exile. And sent into exile to do penance in the 8 great cremation grounds of India. And the 8 great cremation grounds of India become an incredible symbol in Tantric Buddhism of transformation. Old cremation grounds in India are amazing places. I've sort of been near some near villages, because in the very old days, the dead were just left outside the village. They're very lonely places, and they're also regarded as very pure. They're not places for particularly high caste people to be around. They're not places to go to. But there's one of the reasons why they're embraced by the tantric, by the yogin, or by the renunciate, the Buddhist renunciate, or indeed Hindu renunciates. You go there precisely to be left alone, and of course to contemplate death, to contemplate the dead bodies. But in the stories of the cremation grounds, there's a lot more than dead bodies there. There's all sorts of strange, weird, psychic creatures, ghosts and ghouls, and particularly what they call the worldly darkinees, who do all sorts of outrageous things, like dance in front of you and take off their heads, and dance with their heads in their hands, and rip out their entrails and eat them, and generally try to freak you out. Padmasambhava just stayed in these places, ecstatic at the wonderful transformations before him. So in other words, he's somebody, the master of spiritual death and rebirth. And he also travelled to meet different teachers, and he'd heard about a wonderful teacher named śūnyatā Siddhi, which means something like the magical attainment of the sun and the moon. The magical attainment of somebody who's mastered the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon, wow. This can be translated as the solar and lunar energies. They've been mastered. There's all sorts of symbolism here. Solar and lunar, wisdom and compassion, masculine and feminine, wisdom and skillful means, the different sort of energies of the body. Strong stuff. A symbol of enlightenment. And this particular teacher was a great darkening here meaning a female archetype of enlightenment. And he had to go to a place called the Castle of the Skull. The Castle of the Skull. This is where this great teacher lived to receive the teaching, to receive the initiations, to receive the special initiation into spiritual death and rebirth. The Castle of the Skull, it's so expressive, I think. And again, you can sort of reflect on this. Actually, we're in the Castle of the Skull all the time. We're in the Castle of the Skull all the time, because what the Castle of the Skull is pointing to is, of course, universal impermanence. The skull in Buddhist tradition, the death's head generally, is seen as the image of impermanence, the image of death, the image of change. That's what it symbolises. So perhaps the Castle of the Skull isn't really a literal place. It's our human condition. Here we are, alive, human beings, but we are in a world of utter impermanence. There is absolutely nothing that resists impermanence and the fact of death, our own death, the death of loved ones, and this very important meditation, this death can come at any time, at any moment. So what are we going to do with this life? I think when we talk about spiritual death, we have to also talk about actual death. We have to look that in the face. And we have to do that, of course, from the basis of very, very strong mindfulness and positive emotion, so that we can really look into it properly without ending up in a nihilistic place or a depressed place. But we have to look at this because it's our condition. So the Buddha, śūnyatā Siddhi, is in the Castle of the Skull. So he goes in, but he can't go straight in because there's a beautiful woman in the vestibule of the Castle of the Skull, the sort of ante-room of the main chamber. And he asks, so are you śūnyatā Siddhi? He said, no, she said, I'm just the maidservant. And they had this very, very cryptic conversation. And Padmasambhava decides to show his magic powers to her, to show that he's a worthy recipient of the teaching. So she's trying to lift up a sort of chalice used in rituals, and she can't lift it up because of his magical power. But she was a very wise and clever maidservant. She turned to him and said, yes, your power is very great, but what about mine? And at that moment she took a crystal knife and just cut open her chest, in which there were hundreds of thousands of Buddhas. He says, your power is very great, but what about mine? So, in other words, showing the vision of what is possible. So he's in the Castle of the Skull. He's in this realm of death and impermanence. But what opens up then is this vision of the Buddhas. And of course, he bows and shows his humility. He passes the test, and he's taken into the presence of śūnyatā Siddhi, a very impressive darkening, seated, cross-legged, completely red, long black matted hair, with ornaments illustrative of her solar and lunar attainments and garlands of skulls, sitting there, and of course he bows and he asks for the teaching. So she says, "Okay, I'll give you the teaching. I'll give you the teaching. Just sit there and I'll give you the teaching." And at that moment, she transforms him into a syllable. You have to be ready for this. When you go to get ordained, you have to be ready for this. When you go to get initiation, you have to be ready. You might get turned into a syllable. You might get turned into a little word. This was the syllable hum. Primal took it in his stride. I mean, perhaps he didn't have time to think about it, but suddenly he was just a syllable, which he proceeded to eat. Amazing image. Isn't it incredible that she proceeded to eat? I think there's something hugely significant about this. We tend to form an image of the path. There we are, we're going along the path. Integration, positive emotion, spiritual death, rebirth, or the dhyanas. You've probably heard different descriptions of the path. We're going along. But the trouble is, with that language, it can sound as though we're going through it. That's the problem with metaphors. They always have, we're going along unchanged. Actually, when you really change, it's more like you are being eaten, consumed by that higher state of consciousness. It's not that you're getting anything. You're actually dissolving into something much, much greater than you. The death and rebirth is more like you being consumed. This can be, very frightening when you're in the presence. I used to feel this sometimes, I still do when I go and see Sangha Night. I'm in the presence of a vast consciousness, and I feel so tiny. And if I'm in a positive state, I can sort of handle it. If I'm not, it sort of knocks me about a bit. But actually, what you've got to do is open to being consumed. So she swallows him, and of course, inside her, there are all these chakras, all these lotuses, all these sort of states and stages. And as he descends through her throat, through her heart, through her different centres, at each stage he goes through a transformation. One transformation after another. One death and rebirth after another. Being blessed by all sorts of different figures, different Buddhas, different Bodhisattvas. And then she sends him out through her secret place, as they call it in that tradition, and he is radically transformed. And off he goes. She sends him out to carry on doing his work for the Dharma. And not long after that, he receives another name, a new name. One of the things about the life of Padmasambhava, when you read it, he's constantly being given new names. It's very significant. That there's this constant changing of names. He's got so many. Even say he's got 8 special names, 8 hidden names, 8 magic names that change at will. There's a name after name after name. Of course, it's very illustrative of this business of constant death and rebirth, constant transformation, and not just for oneself alone, but for the benefit of others. But anyway, the name he received after this was Padma Tudtren Sao, which is Tibetan. Padma is lotus. Tudtren Sao means strength of the garland or rosary of skulls. Strength of the garland of skulls. And it's said that you can truly wear the garland of skulls, which isn't really anything you wear sort of physically. It's something more that you wear, as it were, on your consciousness, on your being, when you realise śūnyatā, when you realise fully spiritual death and rebirth, when you realise that everything is constant transformation. Nothing stays the same. Everything is changing all the time. When you're the master of that, when you're the full master of that, you turn that into just constant, compassionate, skillful means. So after spiritual death and rebirth, Sangha Night says there's another stage. It's called the stage of spontaneous, compassionate activity. You do what needs to be done. Remember when he explained this? You do what needs to be done. Is that all? You do what needs to be done. But of course, that's an incredibly profound statement. You do what needs to be done for others, because there's nothing in you that's between you and doing what needs to be done for others. You see what others need, and you do it. There's no gap. And in the life of Padmasambhava, he is what Sangha says, when you read the life of Padmasambhava, it spreads over lifetimes. And he says, what you've really got is a sort of transpersonal force of spiritual energy, coterminous with the whole of the Dharma, with the special function of transforming everything, but particularly kind of hostile forces, to transform so that they protect and serve creativity, serve the Dharma. And Padmasambhava is famous for converting the local gods, even the demons, to the service of the Dharma. So there you are. I hope that's enough for you, Vidanya. I hope the story's okay. And I hope you've got some sort of sense of spiritual depth and spiritual rebirth. Thank you.